Hi everybody, Shai here. So we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the history of the ENIAC Extruder Carriage, and I'll walk through some of the early versions, the prototypes, the originals, and then I'll show you guys at the end the final version, and I'll post the file soon. So here we go. Basically, to start off with the original version that came with the Vulcanus Max is the green ones that are back there, and this blue one. Oops. Oh, that's gone somewhere. Alright, try again. So ignore the bed moving for a second, but that's the original parts minus this pink one here. You had the bottom piece, the top part that went right over it, and then you had these clamps. I think that's the order it was in. They even have the right part here, but yep, you had the extruder. The hot end go right through there, through that one, something like that, right? And then you had the 30mm fan there on that side as an intake only, no exhaust. And then up here for the direct drive. I guess sorry for Nemo would sit in there. So that's what we originally started off with and what I originally printed. I was not happy with the idea of direct drive. Was not happy with the way that it mounted. The amount of screws and bolts required, the sandwiching, and the complexity of removing and installing, removing was just way too difficult with all the different bolts. You can see here the plastic was also just way too thin here. And with this is PEG, so we'll bend a little bit, but you can see there's something metal up here and on the bed. But with just a little bit of force, it actually does flex, which is an awful idea. You don't want any flex in your carriage. So yeah, PLA might be a little more rigid, but I still felt that was too thin. And then I found a remixed version, which was a dual extrusion, which was probably even worse, even thinner. Walls didn't even print. This is all in 0.4 nozzle, and just same awful sandwiching. Bearings were not the right portion in there, and would cause the bearings to lock at times. Right, here's the top parts of that one that would just sit right on top of here. Or sorry, that's the bottom part. That's the top. And then another original piece here. And I think this one actually sat on top too, so it had even another piece that would sit on top here. So you're talking about 3 pieces. Again, paint, install, didn't work. All garbage. So let's get rid of these. And then we'll move on to what then became the later designs. Try to go from a clamping design to something that would fit on top of the rods and be able to slide in and out. And the idea was, you know, you'd set this, I can't do it because of my belt here, but I'll show you with one side. You'd set this on top of the rod, you would slide the LM10U in there, and then screw it on the sides here and then the back. You had a nice vent hole here for the dual hot ends, and it seemed like a good design, but did not provide enough cooling. What ended up happening was you would install this top part here, and you can see a later finished design here, and these were quite hefty too, so way too much plastic for what we needed even in PLA or PEG. But you can see you'd install this top part here, you'd have 30mm fans sitting on top of here, pulling the air up, so they would pull the air in through here, over the heatsink, and then out. I think within maybe about an hour or two of printing, the plastic actually began to melt, and you can see some of this blue plastic that was melted on there from, I don't even remember where, but I think that was just the blue plastic that was I was printing with at the time. But it's hard to see, but there's some damage to the inside of it too. These nut traps here, the idea was that you'd have a clamp, so there'd actually be another piece here that would clamp on the hot end, and then you'd tighten it down. And those just did not work at all. They would clamp onto the top of the E3D, not on the groove inside. So you kind of end up with a loose carriage on the bottom. And I think it looked nice and it was functional, but didn't quite work as well. And like I said, it was just way too heavy. You can even see I just tried to do a gasket in here and some flexible filament just to help keep the air in. It was also just way too complex to install. It made installing on the rods easier, but then any kind of maintenance was more difficult. I think the kind of cool thing I liked that I think I broke off here was that there was actually a built-in belt tensioner. As actually you can see it here on this side. As I said, nope, that's the other side. Yep. So you can see the little M3 holes there, right? Those little holes would sit, and there would be a belt tensioner that would sit in front of it and pull the belt tight. It was nice, but it was too complex. Went through a couple of different iterations. Tried to do an idea from one of the Wanhao Cobra ducts to do a double Cobra duct, which actually worked well. It blew a decent amount of air. Went through many iterations of this to get the ducting right and the size right, air blowing in the right direction. But the radial fans were still loud. It felt like they still were not as efficient as they could be, maybe as they are on the Wanhao. And that just didn't work. So we moved on to kind of the next iteration of the design. Idea was to go back to a single carriage. And one of the actual, go back to this one for a second, one of the biggest drawbacks is if you can imagine your carriage is sitting here, your hot end and nozzles may be sitting right here. So if I back up a little bit and we move this forward, you can see not only would it hit the now idler, and you would actually lose some Y space, or you actually would not lose some Y space, sorry, because it would sit further back. But what would end up happening is your nozzle would actually sit right about there. So if you had a maybe taller bed, if you had any bed, your bed would be pretty much right on the aluminum, and cleaning the nozzle, watching that first layer of print was, you'd be kind of looking through here, trying to see, you'd be sticking your hand in through there, sticking your hand through the top. It was just not practical at all from a day-to-day print design. It gave you the full max Z height, I think, of nearly 415 or so. So it was nice, but not a worthwhile compromise. So we went back to sort of the drawing board, trying to think of what I can do to design it differently. And there was many prototypes of this version that I threw away just to clear up space. But the idea was, okay, let's keep the same easy design of sliding this onto the 10mm rods, but let's not have a sandwich type of setup here, and let's also lower the hot end. So I'll show in a second here, but the idea of the hole up here is to hopefully give somewhat of easy access, depending on how big your fingers are or your tools are, to that coupling that's up here. I retain these sort of rabbit ears, hopefully this time at a little better position in comparison to what they are on here and what they are on the motor mounts in the back, so that your belt level stays consistent throughout. Micro switch also mounted right in the middle, whereas before we had him mounted off here to the side, and it kind of sort of hit. So just decided to gain enough on the X where we can afford to lose another few millimeters for the end stop. Put the end stop there in the middle. Belts go through there. M4 bolts go through there, kind of like as posts to hold the rest of the assembly in the bottom, which you'll see in a second. And that's worked. It worked well. There was some minor issues with the belts actually not being, they would end up being at an angle, awkward angle against this, because this is angled in itself. So that was not really practical. And they were also in the way of this M4 bolt if you need to do maintenance later on. So that wasn't really practical. What I did try to do was actually start putting zip tie paths in here for the cable management. And you'll see in a sec, I kind of went a little further on this idea, but you have even a zip tie mount there in the bottom to help hold the end stop wiring, and then two on the back to help mount that. So again, that worked pretty well. And then really went to the next step of the design with the layer fans. Did these as a separate file, kind of try to keep things separate and clean a little bit more rather than trying to do everything in one parts 2D non-shape. Colin had shared this design, I believe, for layer fan mounts, which apparently work with just 40 by 10 millimeter fans, and it works pretty well. I don't know how because it's so flat, but the air just comes right out of the ends, and it works well, right? And it would sit, if you think about it, like right there, right underneath the carriage. And I think it worked. Took that idea and tried to do something similar with flat ducts. It's a bit hard to see in there, but I try to angle the ducting inside, hopefully to help guide the air along down the path. Use similar dimensions to the other one. And this worked okay. Still felt like it wasn't blowing quite enough air. You'd put your hand back here and you'd feel a lot of that sort of back pressure air come back out of there. So yeah, it could have probably been improved. The nice thing is with these mounts, this allowed you to adjust each side of the fan as you want it up and down. You know, I mean, you ideally have them both level, but it made that mounting easy. And then, so this is where we're at with the final design, and I'll walk through each of the parts here real quick to not make this go too long. But basically you have the carriage just as before, and if you can see in there, actually it'd be easier from the back, but yep, it's hard to see, but the groove in here, there's actually a little groove for the belts to go in. These zip ties are just temporary for now until I cut my belts, but you can kind of see in there, there's a little groove for the belt to actually sit in so it doesn't get in the way of these M4 posts, which I'll show in a sec. You then had any kind of clamping, came up with these clamps, really would just hug the GT2 belt, whether you're using the steel or the regular rubber, doesn't matter, but they'll sit around. It's probably overkill, but wanted really to clamp down. There's actually 3 M3 screws that go through here, top, bottom, and in the middle, with nuts on the back, which I'll walk back in a second. Same LM10 clamping as before, you know, being able to clamp down the nut just as we need to, move these nuts that are trapped in here. They're still made for regular M3 hex nuts. In the future they'll be square nuts. Move those back so you can tension and torque these pretty hard. Your PLA or PEDG will start flexing inwards, which is what you want, and it'll start putting that pressure on the LM10, so you get a nice steady carriage. And even without the belts on there, this doesn't really wobble. For the heatsink dunk, I think we were pretty insistent that the heatsink really need to be cooled very well. So we actually have 2 40s. Again, these are Noctuos, but they can be whatever. You know, hopefully with a grill so you don't stick your finger in there. But there's a 40 blowing inwards here, and there's a 40 blowing out on the